Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and today I'm going to be doing the Poetrytube Newbie Tag. So this tag was created by Adrian over at Stripped Cover Lit, and I was tagged to do it by a new or newish booktuber, Cat at Jaguar Cat Lit, and I will link to both of their videos below. So this was a really hard tag to come up with answers for. I've been kind of agonizing over it, and on a couple of questions I just had to finally just say screw it and just put an answer down. Anyway, question 1. Do you read and write poetry, or do you just read it? So I used to be a pretty serious poet when I was in college. I did a chapbook of poetry, and I mean, we printed, I don't know, 30 copies of it or something like this. I submitted poetry all the time to, various journals. I always aimed high. I always sent stuff to the New Yorker, but then I also sent things out to like the Kenyon Review and Poetry Northwest, and never got anything published in a print journal. And then in graduate school, I took a class called Poetics of Peace. And instead of a 20-page term paper at the end, my professor went ahead and let me do a poem cycle. And that was nice to kind of settle into that groove again and kind of turn on that part of my brain again. And I wrote some pretty decent poetry in that class for that project. So number 2, who is your favorite poet? So I'm going to give you 3 answers. The first answer is Sylvia Plath, and this is her first collection of poetry, The Colossus. And Plath was the first really important poet to me in high school, the first really important poet in my life, actually. And then the second poet I'm going to give you is William Stafford, and this is his new and selected poems. I mean, this was published back when I was in college. This is The Way It Is. But Stafford was the most important poet to me in college by some distance. My poetry mentor in college was a man named Scott Starbuck. And God, I mean, I took I don't know how many classes from Starbuck. And Starbuck just revered William Stafford. And his reverence really led me to revere William Stafford. I think Stafford's poetry is more important for the world now than it's probably ever been, but I think he's read less now than he used to be, which is a shame. So if you haven't read William Stafford, please do. Please go out and find a collection of his. And then the poet who is most important to me now, who I am now in this moment, at 43 years old, almost 44 years old, is Christian Wiman. And this is, I think it's Wiman's most recent collection. I think he's got a collection coming out this year, too. But this, I think, is his most recent one, and this is called Once in the West. And if memory serves, I think this was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for poetry. I think. Don't quote me on that. But Wiman is brilliant. Earlier in the 2000s, he was the editor for Poetry Magazine for a decade. And I think really kind of recovered and resuscitated its reputation, and then and then left poetry, and I think he's teaching it. I want to say he's teaching at Yale Divinity School here these days, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. Number 3, what is one question you would ask your favorite poet? And I would ask William Stafford, how can we as individuals better cultivate stillness and quiet in a world that is just constantly spinning more and more out of control? So I wake up every morning and I look at the headlines. I open the Guardian app and I look at the headlines, and I just think the world's gone insane. Like there are stories and there are headlines that make so little sense. It seems like every week there are headlines that could come from The Onion, but they're not from The Onion. They're actual news. There with the dryer. I just feel like the world makes less and less sense every day, and Stafford's poetry did such a good job of kind of locating itself in a quiet space, right? In I don't know, in a kind of register of stillness, And yeah, and he himself was like that too. When you watch interviews with him, he just exuded gentleness. And I would love to ask him what advice he would give to all of us, whether we read poetry or not, write poetry or not, to survive this crazy world. That's what I would want to know from William Stafford. Number 4, what is your favorite poem? So, all-time favorite poem is probably the 1855 version of Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. So it wasn't even called Song of Myself yet at that time, but that 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass is, for me, the best edition of Leaves of Grass. So in case you don't know, Whitman kind of revised and added to Leaves of Grass throughout his life, and so there are all different kinds of editions of it. And by the time he died, Leaves of Grass was fucking huge. And the changes that he made to Song of Myself in particular over the years, I think diminished it as a poem, diminished it as a work. Whitman somehow convinced himself that more was better, and more isn't always better, as we know. Oftentimes more is just more. And that earlier kind of more pared down, more focused version of what would come to be called Song of Myself, I think it's just a perfect poem, which is saying a lot because it's still a really long poem. Number 5, what is your favorite poem to read aloud? That would be Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I'm not going to read it right now because our only copy of it is in an anthology that Kelly has upstairs and that she's actually reading at the moment. So, number 6, who is on your Mount Rushmore of poetry? So this was maybe the most difficult question for me. The first 2 answers are easy, Walt Whitman and Alfred Lord Tennyson. And then I went ahead and went with Plath, just because she has been so important to me. And I know that there are some people, Steve Donahue, talking to you, who believe that Plath is studied for biographical reasons and not for her work. And I think that while that may be true of some people who study her, I don't think that's at all true in general. I think if you read Sylvia Plath's poetry, it is just clinically precise. I mean, there's something so just kind of wonderful and kind of scalpel-like about it that I just think is astonishing. I think it's really stunning. And then there are these wonderful moments of stillness in her work as well. I'm thinking about the first stanza in particular of her poem Ariel, and then moments in Nick and the Candlestick, which is another one of my favorite poems. So Sylvia Plath would be on the Mount Rushmore as well. And I finally decided to settle on Emily Dickinson. So unlike most of the rest of you, I haven't read a lot of Emily Dickinson in my life. I don't know why that is, but I recognize how important she is, and that Dickinson that I've read is brilliant. But I've never kind of found myself as on its wavelength as I would like to be. And the closest I've gotten to that actually was about a year ago. Kelly and I watched the recent film about Emily Dickinson's life. I think it's called Quiet Passion. And Cynthia Nixon plays Emily Dickinson and does a tremendous job. But throughout the film, 3, 4, 5 times throughout the film, there are readings of Dickinson's poetry in Cynthia Nixon's voice. And Cynthia Nixon, it's almost like Cynthia Nixon was born to read Emily Dickinson out loud. Like, for some reason, her readings of those poems made them resonate in me in ways that my own readings of them, silent readings aloud of them over the years, never have. So I feel like I'm maybe getting closer to kind of understanding Dickinson's particular genius than I ever have before. Number 7, what is your favorite poetry collection? I would say that my favorite single volume edition of poetry is Christian Wiman's book, Every Riven Thing. Particularly the title poem. Yeah, I mean, that's another one of my favorite poems to read aloud, actually. And it's quite challenging to read aloud. But I think it's genius. And I think the book as a whole is a work of genius as well. Number 8, rhyming. Talk about it. Yes, no, not anymore. So here's the thing about rhyming in contemporary poetry. To hard end rhymes, I would say no. Internal rhyme, yes, if it's done well, and it can be done really well. And here's the thing. So there's a poem of Wiman's in this book that uses end rhyme that feels, when you're reading it, like internal rhyme. Okay, they're not hard end rhymes. The rhymes end the lines, but as you're reading it, it feels somehow more internal. And I think it's done so well. And so I'm going to read that poem. It is called From a Window. And I'm going to read it just as a kind of example of how I think rhyme can be done beautifully in contemporary poetry. Especially because in Adrian's original video, he seemed to think that it was almost impossible, really, for it to be done well these days. So this is From a Window by Christian Wiman. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically, as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pane as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being undefined, or countless beings of one mind haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision over the house heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men, and that is where the joy came in. So, yeah, that's, I think, a great example of end rhymes that feel like internal rhymes in a contemporary poem. Number 9, barring free verse, what is your favorite poetic form? I really love the sestina. Number 10, humor in poetry or no? No. And number 11, what elements do you think contribute to the best poetry? So what makes the best poetry the best poetry? So for me, I mean, it's a handful of things. Language is so important to me. I really love alliteration, right? This is part of why I love Kubla Khan so much. Alliteration, assonance. I just want language to be musical. Christian Wiman in an interview once was asked sort of how he begins a poem, right? Does it begin with a line or an idea? And he actually said it begins with a sound, like he hears a sound in his head, and he then tries to find the language for the sound that he's hearing. And I also want a poem to really have a strong sense of its particular momentum, okay? So whether like a William Stafford poem, whether it's a poem that's really exploring stillness, or if it's a poem that feels more frenzied like Kubla Khan, I want a poem to be aware of what it's doing with movement. And I also want a poem to have really striking, unusual, unexpected, surprising images and metaphors, similes, and also just really unexpected and moving incident in the poetry. And then lastly, who do I tag? So I know he doesn't make videos very often, and when he does, they're brilliant. But he does love poetry, and he reads a lot of poetry, and that is my friend Caleb. So I'm going to tag Caleb in the hopes that he'll do this. And I'm also going to tag Jasmine at Jasmine's Reads, because she's been reading more poetry here recently, and she included 2 volumes of poetry on her Best of the Year video. And then I'm also going to tag Johnny Keene. Even though I know, Johnny, you don't do tags very often, I thought this would be a tag that would be of interest to you. I know that you've been reading a lot of Ginsberg lately, and a lot about Allen Ginsberg lately, and that you really love the beats. And so I would be interested to hear more about the poetry that you love and why. So that's it. I will see you guys again very soon. Adios.